to begin Unit 5 and take a close look at the Constitution of the United States. Now, the word Constitution, depending on the context, has different meanings, but most commonly, in a political and historical context, the word Constitution means plan of government. Okay? And so, as a plan of government, it lays out the different branches of the government, the different powers assigned to the different branches of the government, the requirements to hold office, the authority, what the government can and cannot do. All of that together represents the Constitution. Now, over the course of American history, we have had two constitutions. The first constitution, developed during the War for Independence, had the name the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were written in the Continental Congress in the year 1777. And then the articles were ratified or approved by the states in the year 1781, and they remained in effect as the government of the United States until 1789. Now, in a very real sense, what the Articles of Confederation represented was not an actual plan of government, because it's actually more of a plan of no government. And let me explain what I mean by that. The Articles of Confederation were written at the worst point during the War for Independence. The Americans were losing the war badly, and there was a growing push for reconciliation with the British government. And the insurgents, who were led by men like George Washington and Richard Henry Lee and Thomas Jefferson, were adamantly against any type of negotiation with the British that would allow for any other outcome other than a total and complete separation from Great Britain, total and absolute independence. And so in 1777, the insurgents had the majority in Congress. So that gave them the ability to largely determine the power and authority the government would have under the Articles of Confederation. And the insurgents designed a government that was extraordinarily weak to the point it could not function. And that's exactly what they wanted. As a member of Congress, insurgents could be removed at any time by their state government. They served a one-year term. And the majority in Congress could shift if opinions changed in the state governments. And so men like Richard Henry Lee could not guarantee that they would be in Congress the next year. But if Congress put in place a constitution, a plan of government, well, Richard Henry Lee may not be there, but the Constitution would. And so what the insurgents designed was a government that could not do anything of consequence. It could not end the war for independence. And when the Articles of Confederation took effect, that meant only the British could end the war. And the only way the British could end the war would be to guarantee the total and complete independence of the new United States. And so, quite often, the historians and political science professors take the Articles of Confederation too seriously as a plan of government. The best way to understand it is it's a war document. And quite often, the political developments that occur during a war are more important, more crucial than what happens on the battlefield. And the example of the Articles of Confederation is one of those times. And so, let's talk a little bit about what the Articles of Confederation was like. And again, further look at how this was a plan, more of a plan of no government. So let me first indicate that the national government under the Articles of Confederation could not enforce its authority. So Congress could pass laws under the Articles of Confederation, but it could not enforce those laws. The enforcement authority was strictly in the hands of state governments. And so Congress, again, could pass a law, but Congress could not enforce the law. They would have to rely on the state governments enforcing the law. And if there were state governments that simply disagreed with the law, then they could choose not to enforce it. And Congress could do nothing about it. Oops. Second, Congress could not levy taxes. So Congress did not have the authority to levy taxes, to raise revenue. And the reality is, when it comes to any government, the two most basic powers it must have are the power to enforce its authority and the power to raise revenue. And yet both of these were specifically denied Congress under the Articles of Confederation. So think about it. If the reconciliationists gained a majority in Congress, well then theoretically they could negotiate a peace with Great Britain, and they could negotiate an end to the war. But they could not enforce that. So George Washington, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, if he refused to stop fighting, no matter what Congress did, the war is still on. Now, George Washington could be fired by Congress. The military had always been under civilian authority. But again, if Congress made the decision to fire George Washington and remove him from command of the Continental Army, then George Washington could say, no, I'm not fired. And Congress could do nothing about it. The reality is, and just think about it, if you do not have the ability to enforce your authority, How much authority do you have? None. Zero. Nada. And then, anything that required money for the government to achieve, you have to have revenue. You have to have the ability to raise that revenue. And again, under the Articles of Confederation, Congress could not raise revenue. What Congress could do is make a requisition, which means simply that they could request, they could ask the states to provide them with some of their money. So they could ask, but then the states could say no, and Congress could do nothing about it. And so, lastly, amendments or changes to the Articles of Confederation. Amendments to the Articles had to be unanimous, which then meant if there was to be an amendment to the Articles of Confederation, every single state, all 13 of them, had to approve the amendment. And that is an impossible standard. It made it virtually impossible for there to be any change made in the Articles of Confederation. It made it impossible for example, members of Congress to pass an amendment that would give Congress the ability to enforce its authority, that would give Congress the authority to raise revenue. That could not be done unless every single state agreed. And so, again, it's very difficult to take the Articles of Confederation seriously as a plan of government for these reasons. But it is one of the things that will be crucial in bringing the war to an end in a way that forced the British to recognize American independence. When the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified and finally took full official effect, that was in, again, the summer of 1781. And by October of 1781, after the Battle of Yorktown, the British government decided to recognize American independence. This, again, the stage was set for this kind of result by the ratification of the Articles of Confederation. So again, it's much better and it's more important to recognize the Articles as a war document, not as a legitimate plan of government. Okay? But then, once American independence was recognized, and once the United States existed now as an independent nation, the only plan of government it had was the Articles of Confederation. And just how bad it was quickly became apparent. The American economy will collapse into a severe economic depression. Countries are reluctant to negotiate commercial treaties with the United States because, again, only Congress could negotiate a commercial treaty. But Congress could not enforce the terms of the treaty. So from the perspective of a foreign nation, that could just be a colossal waste of time. And the British were refusing to evacuate American territory. So we still had enemy troops stationed within the borders of the United States. Congress repeatedly told them to leave, but the British said no. And in many respects, what you had were the major European countries were just kind of surrounding on the edge of the United States, waiting for it to collapse. And as a result of that, they could just pick up the pieces. And so by the mid-1780s, there was a growing concern about the ability of the United States to continue to exist as an independent nation. And let me put up a map that kind of illustrates how this develops. Okay, by the early 1780s, you were already having thousands of Anglo-American settlers moving into what would eventually become the state of Kentucky. But in the 1780s, all of this was still Virginia. Okay, and as a result of this, many of these Anglo-American settlers in Kentucky, they began to produce corn, and they were raising massive quantities of corn that would be measured in the tons. And the only way for them to get their corn out of Kentucky, and something this map doesn't indicate, but right here is a mountain range. And so to get the corn to the American coast, they would have to find a way to get their corn over the mountains to the Atlantic seaboard. And again, this was something well understood by men like George Washington. And so what will happen is, when George Washington finally had no longer needed to be a commander-in-chief because American independence was recognized, George Washington surrendered his authority over the Continental Army and returned the authority of the Army to Congress. He then went home to Mount Vernon. Now, he did that. He surrendered his authority as commander-in-chief in December of 1783. So it's already winter. And so what will happen then is George Washington will return to Mount Vernon. And by the end of March, just as spring is beginning, George Washington will leave Mount Vernon and go on a tour of the Ohio Valley. And the last time he had done that was before the War for Independence began. And then he had determined that it would be necessary to construct 6 canals that could link the Ohio River to the Potomac River. And so when he went back to the Ohio Valley in March of 1784, it had been over a decade since he'd been out there. So he went out there to make sure that his old surveys were still reliable, were still accurate. And they were. And after making that determination, he will return to Virginia and revive the Potomac Canal Company. And so this was a company that was a partnership between private financial interests and the government of Virginia. Because when it came to building canals of this nature that would be linking the Ohio River to the Potomac River. Before that could be done, the government would have to give certain authorization. And so the idea then is that the government had to be part of this company in order to do the things that only the government could do. Now, again, the governments, where they fell short in this time period, is on the side of having the money to pay for the construction of these canals. And so that was where the private financial interests came in. The private side of the company raised the money. The government side of the company passed the legislation that allowed for the things to be done that had to be done. And so this is what, again, takes effect in 1784. George Washington becomes the president of the Potomac Canal Company, and his primary responsibility is to raise revenue. And he raised revenue by selling stock in the Potomac Canal Company. And as he would sell shares of stock in the Potomac Canal Company, that would raise the revenue that would then be used to construct the canals. And the investments would gain value as those canals were then put in place and then utilized by merchants. And so with the Potomac Canal Company, what they had as their long-range plan was to build the canals necessary to connect the Ohio River to the Potomac. And then the farmers, then products from the Ohio River Valley, could be shipped up the Ohio River through these canals to the Potomac River. And then they could be brought down the Potomac River to Alexandria, Virginia, which was it was a large commercial port. And then from Alexandria, it could go down to the Potomac, further down the Potomac into Chesapeake Bay, and then from Chesapeake Bay into the Atlantic Ocean and out to the rest of the world. So George Washington is busy doing what is needed to be done to get those canals constructed. But the process of constructing those canals would take years. And there were farmers in the area of Kentucky that needed those canals right now, immediately. Because again, what's the purpose of raising corn if you can't sell it? And if you can't get the corn from where it's produced to the markets, you can't sell it. And so it's not like these farmers in Kentucky had the luxury of time where they could simply wait. Now, what was an alternate plan that Congress contemplated until those canals could be put in place would be to have those farmers in Kentucky transport their corn on barges down the Ohio River, where the Ohio River then connected to the Mississippi River, and then down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And then from New Orleans, they could be shipped around the Florida Peninsula to the eastern seaboard of the United States. Now, Congress tried in 1785 and 1786 to negotiate a treaty with Spain. And again, the reason Spain had to be brought into this is because Spain controlled the Mississippi River. And for any American farmer to have access to the Mississippi River, they had to have the permission to navigate the river from Spain. The port of New Orleans was, again, controlled by Spain. And to have access to the port, you had to have Spain's permission. And so over the course of the negotiations with Spain, Spain made it clear, under no circumstance would they allow Americans to use the Mississippi River. Under no circumstance would they allow the United States to have any access whatsoever to the port of New Orleans. And so this left those farmers in Kentucky stuck. And what will begin to happen in 1786 is what's known as a breakaway movement. And what you had was a growing sentiment among these farmers that what they needed to do was break away from the United States and join the Spanish Empire. Now, again, this map only shows U.S. territory, but the area west of the Mississippi River was Spanish Louisiana. To the southwest, you had Spanish Texas. And, again, in the 1780s, 1790s, and early 1800s, the whole country of what we recognize today as Mexico was under Spanish control. And so Spain still had a vast American empire. And for those farmers in Kentucky, if they broke away from the United States and joined the Spanish Empire, then that would automatically give them access to the Mississippi River. And that would automatically give them access to the port of New Orleans. Now, for us today, the idea of Anglo-American settlers breaking away from the United States and becoming part of the Spanish Empire seems like an impossibility. But the important thing to recognize is the concept of nationalism did not yet exist. Nationalism is when you recognize yourself, you identify yourself by the country in which you were born. So for those of us who were born in the United States, we are Americans. Okay? Well, again, that is nationalism. But again, nobody at this point was yet even thinking of themselves as an American, as British, as French, as Spanish. Okay? That type of identification system did not yet exist. So it was easy, far easier than it would be today, for people like those farmers in Kentucky from switching their allegiance from the United States to Spain. If the choice for them was to go bankrupt and lose everything, or switch their loyalty to the Spanish Empire, that's a no-brainer. Switch. And what was slowing down the process of getting these canals done was the fact that there was no overall governing authority to manage the process. It had to be done state by state. And so what will happen, and what will help illustrate what eventually propels this breakaway movement, is the Potomac River is shared by two states. Maryland and Virginia. So again, when it came to building the canals, Virginia had to make sure that Maryland was okay with it. And that's again where the Virginia government would have to negotiate with the Maryland government for permission for the Potomac Canal Company to build those canals. And so again, Virginia will conduct a series of meetings with Maryland government authorities. Maryland will agree to the terms and support the whole idea. But then the further they went, they also began to realize that these canals would also have to cross into Pennsylvania territory. So now they had to bring in Pennsylvania. And then when Maryland and Virginia approached Pennsylvania, they said they wanted New Jersey to be involved as well. And then some Virginians will then insist, for reasons of their own, to include North Carolina. And so this process, under the Articles, had the political authority so fragmented, requiring the Potomac Canal Company in Virginia to do so many other kinds of negotiations, to allow for so many different variables, that significantly delayed the entire process. So by the end of 1785, George Washington had raised all of the money necessary to pay for the construction of the canals. What was slowing things down were the politics of it. And so, this is going to sound tedious, but it's an important point, okay? When it comes to commerce, commercial activity, in a country like the United States, you have intra-state commerce, and you have interstate commerce. Intrastate means that's the commerce, that's the commercial activity that occurs within the borders of only one state. Okay? That is intrastate commerce. If the commercial activity crosses the border from one state into another, that then becomes interstate commerce, where the commercial activity involves more than one state. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, no one had any controlling authority over interstate commerce. State governments had complete control over their intrastate commerce, but no governing authority had any role in terms of interstate commerce. Okay? And so again, this is why things on the political side of the Potomac Canal Company are moving so slowly. And all the while things are moving slowly, these Anglo-American farmers in Kentucky are getting more and more desperate. And so what you have is, after that first meeting between Maryland and Virginia, after that meeting went so well and accomplished so much, Maryland and Virginia decided that they would have a meeting like this every year. That way, there would always be planned a meeting that could resolve any issues that may come up in the future. And since Virginia hosted the first meeting, Maryland would then host the second meeting. And the Maryland government announced that they would hold their meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. And that meeting would begin on September 11th, 1786. 86. Now, what will happen then is, initially, this meeting at Annapolis was to only include Maryland and Virginia. But then, Pennsylvania. Maryland recognizes the need to bring Pennsylvania into it. And Pennsylvania says yes, but only if New Jersey comes into it. And then those voices I mentioned a moment ago in Virginia say, but we also want to bring North Carolina into this. And then concerns are raised that also then require New York to be brought into it. And so then, what was originally to be a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, between Maryland and Virginia, had now become a meeting that involved Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, North Carolina, and New York. And at that point, James Madison, who was a delegate in the Continental Congress representing Virginia, he will then stand before Congress and invite every single colony to attend the Annapolis Conference. And they accept. Because what Madison understood is the only way to deal with this issue of interstate commerce would be to give Congress, as the national legislative body, to give Congress the authority over interstate commerce. Then it's no longer in the hands of individual state governments. Any kind of commercial activity that crosses from one state into another would come under the authority of Congress, not the states. But in order to do that, you have to amend the Articles of Confederation. And remember, any amendment had to be unanimous. So that meant every single state had to be involved. And so, when the Annapolis Conference is scheduled to begin, only 5 states had showed up. Again, every state had accepted the invitation. But by the time the meeting began, only 5 had shown. Those 5 waited around, hoping more would show up. But they never did. So after about 5 days of waiting, they broke up the conference and resigned themselves to failure. And at this point, the breakaway movement in Kentucky really intensified. Now, as it turned out, all of those states that didn't show up, they were trying to show up. But again, this is something that is part of the world that it's hard for us to relate to. If you lived in Maryland, you knew where Annapolis was. If you lived in Virginia, right along the Chesapeake Bay with Maryland, you knew where Annapolis was. But you had people from places like Massachusetts and New Hampshire Georgia and South Carolina that had no idea where Annapolis was. So as it turned out, there were many other delegates from other states in the area. They just didn't know where Annapolis was located. And so that, again, was a problem that no one saw coming, because when Annapolis was originally scheduled as the site for the meeting, only Maryland and Virginia were involved. And so if it had remained just a conference for Maryland and Virginia, then everyone who would be involved knew exactly where to go. So once the leaders of the Annapolis Convention realized that others were trying to get to the meeting, they just simply couldn't find it, then the leaders, in this case they're led by James Madison, will then inform Congress that they're going to reschedule the meeting. They're going to reschedule the meeting to be held in May of 1787. And the meeting that would be in May of 1787 would be held in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia had been the seat of the Continental Congress for over a decade during the War for Independence. At the point where we are in the mid-1780s, the seat for the Continental Congress was New York City. But everyone knew how to get to Philadelphia. So there'd be no confusion over how to get to a meeting in Philadelphia, like you had over a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. Okay? And so when this second meeting is scheduled to be held in Philadelphia, it will become, and it is known variously as, the Philadelphia Convention. And, of course, it was known as the Philadelphia Convention by those who were participating in the events, because that's what it was, a convention held in Philadelphia. How it's most commonly referred to today is it's referred to as the Constitutional Convention, because what is produced at this convention is the United States Constitution, which is our second plan of government. And so when it comes to the United States Constitution as a second plan of government, it was written in 1787. It was ratified in 1788. And then it took effect in 1789. And as of today, fingers crossed, our Constitution is still in effect. The Constitution of the United States is still in effect. And so it is a plan of government that now represents the oldest Constitution ever written in world history. It has created a government that has remained intact for over 200 years. And that has not been matched at any point in the history of the world. And that says something. That should tell us something about our Constitution. It works. It works. Okay? And so, what I want to talk about next are the specific circumstances that allowed for the Constitution to occur. Those who wrote the Constitution are often characterized as the Founding Fathers. And this has the effect of elevating them to kind of a quasi-religious stance, that they are the Founding Fathers. Okay? And the idea then is that these were men who were visionaries. They understood the problem, and by golly, they were going to fix it. They knew what had to be done, and they did it. And we ascribe this kind of rhetoric around them that deifies them. And what we've lost is the simple fact that for many of the people involved, they couldn't stand each other. We were lucky that no one at the Constitutional Convention were carrying knives, because sometimes things got so angry and bitter and mean-spirited, it's like, I want to stick you, man. In other words, what I want you to understand is that these guys we call the Founding Fathers are a whole lot like we are. So there's a lot of political division, a lot of political animosity among us today. It's as if we're tearing ourselves apart. Where these guys were different is they were able to set aside their differences and focus on the common ground. They were able to set aside their differences and focus on mutual interests, mutual concerns. There are too many people today who refuse to do that, and that's the problem. We're going to look at a handout here shortly that focuses on the Constitution as a bundle of compromises. So our Constitution would not exist had the framers of the Constitution been unwilling to compromise. And today, again, for too many Americans, compromise is unacceptable. They refuse to compromise. You either do it their way, or you're screwed. And to a large extent, this is brought about by the very intense political rhetoric of where the one side characterizes the other side as evil. Okay? And both sides do this to varying degrees. And the problem with that is, how do you compromise with evil? You can't compromise with evil. And so if you are convinced, for whatever reason, the people on the other side from yourself are evil, then our Constitution will not survive, because it cannot survive without the willingness of at least a majority of us to compromise. Not all of us have to agree to compromise. So there can be people on the fringe, but the majority of us have to be willing to set aside our differences and work out an agreement. And that kind of mindset is the only one that will allow for our Constitution to survive. And so I'm going to end this first presentation now, and we will pick up in the next one looking at the Constitution as a bundle of compromises. Okay?